We've talked about World War II in our podcast before. You've heard it referenced in our episodes on Anne Frank and D-Day. Today's episode focuses on a past moment in history that came after World War II, but existed because of that conflict.
Tell me everything!
After World War II, Germany lost the war, along with the other Axis powers of Italy and Japan and their allies around the world. When World War II was over, Germany was divided under the control of the Allied powers. The United States, the Soviet Union, otherwise known as the USSR, or what we know today as Russia, and then Britain and France.
I remember hearing about that.
After the war, when the Allied powers were dividing up Germany, they also divided up Berlin, the capital of Germany. Although the city of Berlin is technically located in the eastern part of Germany, this city was also divided into east and west sectors. The Soviet Union controlled the east, and the US, France, and Britain controlled the west. West Berlin became a symbol of Western democracy and capitalism, while East Berlin and East Germany was aligned with communism.
What happened?
To keep the two sides of Berlin separated, a wall was built by the East German Soviet government. The Berlin Wall created all kinds of challenges.
Like what, Mama?
Well, for one, the wall stopped families from being able to see each other if they lived on different sides of it. It prevented people from going to jobs, and it created a lot of struggle within Berlin. It also created a lot of tension between the Eastern and Western governments. This wall symbolized something called the Cold War.
More on that later.
For years, the Berlin Wall stood as a symbol of the political division and the line between democracy and communism. On November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down, and this was celebrated around the world. Listen in to learn more about this past moment from history as we explore today the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Welcome to Check This Out, podcast for kids.
And their grown-ups, where we explore people, places, ponderings, and past moments from history that shape the world around us. My name is Amy Contreras.
And I'm Cece.
Today is another episode in our series on past moments from history. So far, we've talked about D-Day, Juneteenth, and the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, as well as the 4th of July. Today, we're going to head into a different moment in the past, 1989 to be precise.
That was a long time ago.
Hey, it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't even 40 years ago. Other parents, please don't be offended by my child thinking 1989 was a long time ago.
That's funny.
Okay, Chuckles. Today's past moment is focusing on the fall of the Berlin Wall. But before we can talk about the wall falling and why this is a past moment from history we still talk about today, we all need to understand a few things that were happening in the decades that led up to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
What does that word mean?
Decades? A decade is a way we measure time, Cece. A decade is 10 years. So between when World War II ended in 1945 and the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it was 44 years, or a little over 4 decades, because 4 decades would be 40 years.
Got it.
So as we mentioned, after Germany was defeated, it was divided up by the winning powers, the US, the UK, France, and the USSR, or the Soviet Union. East Germany became the Soviet Union's place in Western Europe. It was where they were able to get established. Because Berlin was split 4 ways with British, French, and American zones in the west of the city and a Soviet zone in the east, West Berlin kind of became a little island of democracy and capitalism that was surrounded by communist East Germany. And these are just different political philosophies that are very different from one another. The wall was eventually built in 1961 because East Berlin was losing people to the west.
Can you explain that to me?
Sure, Cece. On August 13th, 1961, the communist government of East Germany began to build a barbed wire and concrete wall between East and West Berlin. The government's official purpose of this Berlin Wall was to keep so-called Western fascists from entering East Germany and undermining the socialist state. But really what the wall did was it primarily served the objective of stopping mass amounts of people from leaving East Germany and heading to West Germany. So throughout the 1950s and even the early 1960s, a lot of people who lived in East Germany fled to West Berlin and West Germany. They were looking for political freedom and economic opportunities. And so all these people leaving led to a big population drop in East Berlin and East Germany. To stop people from leaving, the East German communist government and the USSR, the local leaders, decided to build a physical barrier or a wall to stop people from leaving.
How was life there?
Things were tense. People wanted to leave East Berlin because they didn't feel like they had the same freedom and opportunity as they would in the West. People left in big numbers, which made the government nervous. After the wall was built, it also became this powerful symbol that represented the division between the democratic West and the communist East.
Why does that matter?
The wall was this physical representation of something that was happening around the world called the Cold War. And at the start, we mentioned this and we said we'd explain more about that later.
Check this out.
Here's a helpful overview of what the Cold War was from Britannica for Kids. After World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were the superpowers of the world. They became rivals as they tried to prevent the other from getting too much power. The period of tension that existed between them became known as the Cold War. Although the conflict didn't result in any actual war between the two countries, it did lead to a number of smaller wars.
That's too bad.
Remember that during World War II, the Soviet Union helped liberate many countries of Eastern Europe from Nazi Germany. But after the war, the Soviet Union continued to control the countries and forced its own communist economic system and government system on them. The United States didn't want communism to spread to other countries in Europe. The United States also wanted the Western European countries as allies or friends. So the Berlin Wall was like a physical representation of this tension between democratic countries like the US and the UK and France in Europe and the communist rule of the USSR or the Soviet Union.
Good to know.
The wall was a big deal. It ran all the way through Berlin. It consisted of barbed wire, guard towers, and concrete barriers. The wall basically stopped people from leaving East Berlin.
How unfair.
Yeah, people did not like the wall, but the Eastern government really wanted to stop people from leaving, and the wall stood for a long time. But then things started to shift. By the 1980s, the Soviet Union faced major economic problems. They were running out of money. They also had major food shortages. Then there was a big nuclear reactor disaster at the Chernobyl power station in Ukraine. It exploded in April of 1986 and it caused a lot of damage. So all these signals showed that the Soviet Union or the USSR was under a lot of pressure and people were unhappy. Reform movements started and political unrest was on the rise.
Things were not easy.
You're right. In May of 1989, Hungary began dismantling its border with Austria, which allowed East Germans to flee by neighboring countries, not just through West Berlin like they had done before. On October 9th of 1989, which was just within days of East Germany celebrating its 40th anniversary, over 70,000 people took to the streets to protest.
A lot was happening.
Sure was. Remember, the Berlin Wall was built in 1961 and it came down in 1989, so we're almost up to this key past moment from history. On November 9th, 1989, the East German government made a mistake at a press conference, and this mistake led to the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Tell us!
East German leaders had tried to calm protests by loosening the borders and making travel easier for East Germans. They had not meant to open up the border completely. A man named Günter Schabowski ran a press conference with a ton of journalists, and it was all over the TV. Poor Günter had no time to review the talking points before the press conference, and so he announced live on TV that East German citizens could now cross the border freely. The journalists were stunned and he got asked a lot of follow-up questions. And so when he was asked for details, Mr. Schabowski said that as far as he was aware, the changes to the border were effective immediately. Again, this was all over the news, so crowds of people made their way to the wall.
I can imagine.
The border guards became overwhelmed by the crowds of people, and ultimately they opened the gates, which led to masses crossing and celebrating on both sides. The border guards didn't know what to do, but there were hundreds of people at the wall and only a few border guards, so they opened the wall. And with that, the Berlin Wall fell.
What an amazing story!
Yeah, it's a really fascinating one. One of the things I find really fascinating is that over the time that it existed, from 1961 to 1989, at least 171 people died trying to get over, under, or around the Berlin Wall. But it wasn't completely effective. More than 5,000 East Germans, including people who worked as border guards, managed to cross the border by doing all kinds of crazy things. They would jump out windows that were next to the wall. They'd climb through the barbed wire. Some people even flew over in hot air balloons or crawled through the sewers. One person drove through an unfortified part of the wall at a high speed to get through. So people were really creative in breaking through the Berlin Wall while it stood.
I want to check out more about that.
After the Berlin Wall fell, it was dismantled, and full sections were torn down by civilians celebrating. These were just regular people who lived in East Germany who saw the wall coming down as a symbol of freedom.
I wish I could have seen that.
You know, it's really cool. Images of people taking apart the Berlin Wall are something I remember from my childhood. We can look at it together online.
I'm excited.
The fall of the Berlin Wall was kind of like the beginning of the end for East Germany's communist regime. It also helped lead to Germany's reunification, which happened on October 3rd, 1990. It took over a decade after Germany came back together to really operate as one country economically and socially, but the fall of the Berlin Wall was the start of that journey. Soon after the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union broke itself up into 15 separate nations. Communist rule ended in many countries, and ultimately this all brought an end to the Cold War. We covered a lot today. Did you keep up with it all?
Let's recap.
Okay, here's the recap. After World War II, the Allied powers divided up Germany. Part was controlled by the democratic and capitalist countries, the US, UK, and France, and part was controlled by the communist USSR. People in communist East Berlin were leaving in big-time numbers to the west, so a wall was built called the Berlin Wall. That wall existed from 1961 to 1989. It came down after protests and a lot of political progress with the Cold War coming to an end. The Berlin Wall officially came down or fell or opened on November 9th, 1989.
That's a big deal.
It was. Now, just like always, we have a quick poem for you before you go. The Berlin Wall stood between East and West. This iron curtain was hard to best. For years it stood, angry and strong. But the world knew it couldn't last long. People protested and took to the streets, pushing to travel and for a chance to be free. A little mistake opened the gates. The end of the wall is a moment of grace. Thanks for listening with us as we talked about the past moment from history, the fall of the Berlin Wall. At Check This Out, we know it can be hard to know if information you find online is accurate. We use verified sources to build the stories you hear about. And if you want to learn more about any topics we talk about, we encourage you to be your own best thinker. Go to your local library, head online with a grown-up, find a documentary to watch about the person, place, or past moment we discuss. Your learning journey is in your own hands. What do you want to learn more about? For this week, our sources are BBC, History.com, and Encyclopedia Britannica.
Thanks for listening. See you next episode. Don't forget to subscribe.